I am young. I am 20 years old. Yet I know nothing of life but despair, death, fear, and fatuous superficiality. Cast over an abyss of sorrow, I see how peoples are set against one another, and in silence, unknowingly, foolishly, and obediently, innocently slay one another. I see that the keenest brains of the world invent weapons and words to make it yet more refined and enduring. And all men of my age, here and over there, throughout the whole world, see these things. All my generation has experienced these things with me. What would our fathers do if we suddenly stood up and came before them and proffered our account? What do they expect of us if a time ever comes when the war is over? Through the years, our business has been killing. It was our first calling in life. Our knowledge of life is limited to death. What will happen afterwards? And what shall come out of us? Paul Baumer is the main protagonist and narrator of All Quiet on the Western Front. Paul and his classmates, Tjaden, a skinny locksmith, Albert, a lance corporal, who is clearly the clearest thinker of them all, Mura, who uses his understanding of physics to find out at which angle the bomb will hit the ground and explode, and Lear, who is a player, for he is smooth with the ladies. Paul and all of his classmates, Tjaden, Albert, Mura, and Lear, are all persuaded by their patriotic teacher, Kantorek, to fight in the war. All are 19 years young, and completely unaware and unprepared for the dangers that they will encounter in their experience on the Western Front. Along the way, they make other friends, like Kaczynski, who is the oldest and wisest of them all, for he is always one step ahead of everyone else. Then there's Hai, who is the same age as Paul, who is also a peat digger. Together, and only together, will they be able to survive on the brutal Western Front. And on their journeys ahead, they'll realize Kantorek was wrong all along.
The hardest of times can teach you some of the most important lessons. And it was only after I read the difficult and saddening All Quiet on the Western Front by Eric Remarque that I learned the important lessons of home and comradeship. When I felt sad about the story of Paul, when this book made me feel hate towards the war, I learned that only after reading this book that has taught me two very important lessons that will aid me through the odyssey of life. No other time in my life was this more obvious than when I lay in my bed in pensive mood just after reading the harsh and disheartening All Quiet on the Western Front. I was startled by the end of the book, but I was also relieved that I was finished with this book, for it was hard for me to get through it. I started to reflect, and for a while all I could think of was death. I was stuck. But then I started to think of my friends and home. I began to connect with Paul. I remember how he always wanted to go back home, and now he had all those good times with his comrades. It made me think that friendship and home are also very fragile. And one day it could all fall and shatter into thousands of pieces. It didn't matter that this book made me feel like I was fighting on the front. It didn't matter that this book made me feel sad for these soldiers. And it didn't matter that at points I simply wanted to stop reading this book. It only mattered that through all of these adversities, I learned two important lessons about life. And those are that friends and your home are fragile. For me, I now know that the hardest things in life will always push you back, but they will always teach you an important lesson that will help you move forward. A friend can always make a bad experience a tiny bit better. And it was in the book All Quiet on the Western Front by Eric Remarque, where even on the front, Paul's friends made him feel like he wasn't alone. Paul and his comrades have gone through a lot together, for they are fighting one of the most gruesome wars ever. However, this never seems to stop them from having each other's back. In Chapter 9, Paul and his comrades are tasked to scout on the enemy to assess their strength. While scouting, Paul is caught in an artillery barrage, and he then desperately tries to run back to friendly trenches. All of a sudden, something comes over him. My limbs are glued to the earth. I make a vain attempt. They refuse to come away. I press myself down on the earth. I cannot go forward. I make up my mind to stay lying there. Paul knows that after an artillery strike, an enemy attack is bound to come. In his desperation to live, he hides himself in the bottom of a crate. Paul feels alone and scared, but then he begins to hear something. Now I hear muffled voices. To judge by the tone, that might be cat talking. These voices, these quiet words, these footsteps in the trench behind me recall me at a bound from the terrible loneliness and fear of death by which I had been almost destroyed. They are more to me than life. These voices, they are more motherliness and more than fear. They are the strongest, most comforting thing there is anywhere. They are the voices of my comrades. I am no longer a shuddering speck of existence, alone in the darkness. I belong to them and they to me. We all share the same fear and the same life. We are nearer than lovers in a simpler, a harder way. I could bury my face in them, in these voices, these words that have saved me and will stand by me. Paul describes the voices of his comrades as the strongest and most comforting things in the world. Paul would have been lost without his comrades' voices, but his comrades' voices are more than life. He is not alone with his comrades, and without them he is not a shuddering speck of existence, alone in the darkness. They all share the same fear and the same life, a life that has been robbed by this very war. As a cause of all these similarities, they become closer than lovers. They are bound by this very thing called comradeship. Throughout the rest of the book, Paul and his comrades become closer and closer. And even though some die along the way, that just brings them that much closer. This is because, as Paul describes, but by far the most important result was that it awakened in us a strong, practical sense of esprit de corps, which in the field developed into the finest thing that arose out of the war, comradeship. Paul and his comrades have been able to survive for so long due to the comradeship among each and every one of them, and without it, they wouldn't have been able to survive for so long. Some are able to navigate through the storm. Some aren't. In the book, All Quiet on the Western Front, by Eric Remarque, Paul's generation has been beat down from this horrifying war, and some are able to move on. However, some simply cannot. For the past 3 years now, Paul's generation has been tarnished by this very war. Many feel disconnected from society. Now if we go back, we'll be weary, broken, burnt out, rootless, and without hope. We will not be able to find our way anymore. Paul's generation was just beginning to love life, but now their lives have been taken away from them. It is autumn now. Paul has been given a 2-week rest for swallowing a bit of gas. Paul talks about the possibility of an armistice, and Paul remarks if there is no armistice, the troops will revolt in anger. He spends many of his days thinking outside in the sun of a tranquil journey home. He talks about how if they returned home 2 years prior, out of suffering and the strength of their experience, they might have released the storm. However, now, if they go back broken and without hope, they will never find their way home. And men will not understand us, for the generation that grew up before us, though it has passed these years with us, already had a home and a calling. Now it will return to its old occupations, and the war will be forgotten, and the generation that has grown up after us will be strange to us and push us aside. We will be superfluous even to ourselves. We will grow older. A few will adapt themselves. Some others will merely submit, and most will be bewildered. The years will pass by, and in the end, we shall fall into ruin. All Quiet on the Western Front. Chapter 12. Paul is hopeless. The war, his comrades' deaths have crushed him. He is unmotivated to live. He is lost. He reflects on how his generation, Those who fought in the war will never be understood by the other generations. They simply will be pushed aside. When the war is over, the soldiers will have no calling, because for the past 3 years, their calling has been the front. The front is their home. And after the war, they will be homeless. They are nothing without the war. Some will be able to adapt to this new society that lacks the front. However, as years go by, some will be lost. They, in the end, will fall into ruins. Throughout the rest of the book, Paul remains hopeless. He comes to the realization that his generation is lost. We are forlorn like children and inexperienced like old men. We are crude and sorrowful and superficial. I believe we are lost. This war was a storm. Paul and his generations were put on tiny boats and asked to navigate through the storm, but the waves were too big. They couldn't navigate through the storm. They are lost. They are unable to make it out. They are hopeless. They are the lost generation. This book truly was something else. At the beginning of the book, I thought it was your normal war book. But the more and more I read, the more I realized that what this book was truly about. The book has made me go through an emotional roller coaster, for it has shown me so many horrifying things. It was the physical pain these soldiers went through, but the scariest part of all was definitely the physiological damage these soldiers encountered. Sure, the way the dead bodies were described were horrific, but the mental trauma was just down to earth, one of the most frightening things I've ever heard of. I do think the author wrote this book to show people what these soldiers were going through, and I think it was an attempt to stop another war from happening so we don't lose another generation to another war. However, still now, wars rage across the earth, and we still haven't learned our lesson. For me, it made me feel an even greater hate towards all war, and how they are like a selfish 5-year-old with candy, taking and never giving. It made me view these wars as meaningless, and that they only fought for a man's greed and lust for power. Truly, this book is something else. It's taught me countless lessons about life, family, and friends. And without this book, I don't think I'd ever learn it from anywhere else. It's one of a kind. The lessons I have learned from this book I will keep with me to the day I die, and I will pass them down to the next generation, and hopefully they will do the same. One day, we can hopefully live in a world without hate and without war. Who knows if that day will ever come. This book is neither to be an accusation nor a confession, and at least of all an adventure. For death is not an adventure to those who stand face to face with it. It will try simply to tell a generation of who, even though they may have escaped the shells, were destroyed by the war. That's what's written at the beginning of the book, and I wish I'd read that, for it would have told me the themes that I were about to encounter. But I didn't, and I can't change that. What I'm trying to say is there's some things you can take control of, and that is your future. I am not like Paul. My life has not been stripped from me. I am not lost. I have meaning. That has given me the wanting to do something important and meaningful in my life. So for you, the ones watching this right now, what is something that you want to do? And at least make sure it's something that brings you meaning to this world, and especially joy. And make sure it also will help us progress to a more peaceful and affluent society.